Okay, today's lecture takes a break from the chronological historical timeline that I've been following. We kind of take a pause to talk about privilege and racism. And so it's in recent years, it's been a controversial subject. Yeah, but I think if there's any place on the planet where we should not be censored, where we should be able to talk about anything, is in a US university classroom. And so, yeah, let's get to it. And again, feel free to ask questions, and it also doesn't mean you have to agree with everything I say. We can talk about things. So we'll do a little exercise where you're going to make a list from 1 through 20. And I'm gonna call out a series of experiences, 20 of them, and you'll keep track of how many of them apply to you. And this is not something you're gonna turn in. So you don't, I don't know, you're answering it for yourself. Although I will ask you to answer, this is not going to be graded either, but I am going to ask you to answer how many of them ultimately applied to you out of the 20. So I'm going to make 20 statements. If the statement refers to an experience that has happened to you on a regular basis, you check it off. Otherwise, you don't. And so we're going to keep track of how many apply to you. All right, let's get to it. If you've ever gone to bed without dinner or with an unusual dinner, such as, say, for example, crackers and water for dinner, and this was because you or your parents could not afford a balanced meal. So if this has happened to you, you check it off. If not, you leave it blank. Number 2, if on more than one occasion you have been asked by strangers if you'll sell them drugs, or been pulled over by police without having broken any law. This is, if either of these is applied to you, check it off. If not, leave it blank. If neither you nor your parents have ever inherited money or property. So if you or your parents have inherited money or property, then this does not apply to you. Number 4, if there have been occasions where you were assumed incompetent at your job or a sport because of your gender. Number 5, if you've ever been unable to tell your loved ones about the person you're romantically interested in because that person was of the same sex as you. Number 6, if you have been afraid that you or your parents might not come back at the end of the day because they might be deported or get incarcerated. And obviously this also applies if not only you were afraid this was going to happen, but it actually happened. Number 7, if you've been regularly concerned for your safety while walking home from school or work. Eight, if you were never taught history that was relevant to your family and ancestors' history in K through 12. Number 9, if you've never seen a superhero or good guy on TV or movies that you could identify with. 10. If you've ever had to learn a new language in order to function in school and society, even if it was just for a few weeks. 11, if you've ever been unable to do your regular activities because of a physical handicap or illness that lasted at least 3 weeks. 12, if as a child or teen, you did not personally know anyone who had gone to college. 13, if neither you nor your parents have ever gotten a job due to a personal connection within a company or place of employment. 'I know some of these can be a little confusing because they're like double negatives, but 14, if you've ever experienced most people around you celebrating or practicing something that goes against your religious beliefs. 15, if you've ever been unable to participate in your scheduled activities due to a brain chemical imbalance, PTSD, or mental illness. 16, if you grew up without a relationship with one or more of your biological parents. 17, if you've ever had to wait for public transportation in either extremely hot or cold weather, or if you've ever been unable to get to where you needed to because of a lack of transportation. 18, if you are currently a parent while you are in college. 19, if you had to quote unquote grow up early by either having to work and contribute to your family's income, as a teenager, or having to be a cultural broker and interpreter for your parents as a child. 20, if you had to move from homes and schools 3 or more times during K through 12. All right, so those are the 20 experiences. Any you want me to go back to, repeat, or explain? All right. Anyone have any ideas of things that could be added to this list of 20? Things missing? All right, so what you came up with some ideas for 21, and so that means what is this exercise about? What is this a list of? What kind of experiences are these? It would be, well, people often it's sort of the conventional way that people talk about this is talking about privilege. I'll explain why I think it's more useful to talk about them in terms of disadvantages, and I'll get to that in a bit. And yeah, did you end up, if it's a list of disadvantages, did you have more or less than you thought you would? With a list of 20. How many did you experience? And there is a link on Canvas to have you answer how many you experienced. That isn't something that is graded, but yeah, just know that, and you don't have to do that now. It can be later. So am I privileged or am I just normal? To begin with, I think I in particular argue that I think it is more practical, useful, successful to talk about disadvantages instead of privilege, because privilege has these connotations of being associated with being spoiled or wealthy. And in the United States, whether you're working class, middle class, or upper class, everyone identifies with being middle class. So even the wealthy don't identify as being spoiled or wealthy. And so yeah, I think as soon as people hear the word privilege, there's a hesitancy to identify with it. Privilege is also commonly taken for granted by those who have it. It's often perceived as just normal. And so I think it's helpful to talk about advantages and disadvantages. Advantages would be related to what we usually talk about with regard to privilege. And some of us end up having more privileges than we realize. The first time I did that exercise, I had a training to be an RA when I was an undergrad, and we did a similar exercise. And I assumed that I was going to have all the disadvantages or no privilege, and I was wrong. I had privilege. I had some privileges. And so I ended up having more than I realized. And I think some students have the opposite experience where they just, they assume they're going to be privileged, and then they realize they have more disadvantages than they thought they would after doing that, going through that list of 20 experiences. Well, what was I going to say? Here's one definition for privilege. The unearned advantage we get from being part of a dominant group whose needs have been traditionally been prioritized. It's not the only definition, it's one. But again, I think when we talk about privilege or disadvantages, it's also useful to talk about not only racial privilege, because race is only one factor among many factors and many types of privilege. And so I think I think that's a drawback to when people talk about privilege to only talk about race. I think it makes it easier for people to become defensive because you're kind of equating one factor with all privilege, but it isn't the only type of privilege. Instead, we are all intersectional. Our identities are more than just our race. Our identity is multifaceted. We all have a race, a citizenship, a gender, a language, a degree of wealth, somewhere on the spectrum, where we live, a body size, our mental health, our sexuality, our abilities, our degree of education. And this is just a list of factors. This is not all the potential. For example, religion is not on here. And there's lots of different factors. Our identities are multifaceted so that we are not just our race. We're not just our age. We're not just our religion. We are many things simultaneously, and different people will identify more or less with different factors of their intersectional identity. And so, you may have an advantage or privilege with regard to, say, being a university student, but then have a disadvantage, coming from a low-income family. for example, or being first generation college student, where you didn't have a lot of the cultural capital that helped you get to where you are. I'll talk about cultural capital in a bit and define it in case you're not familiar with that. Advantages and disadvantages are, so with intersectionality, we all have unique intersectionality, unique advantages and disadvantages from the different factors of our identity. Advantages and disadvantages or privilege can also be positional, meaning no one is exempt. We have advantages or disadvantages regardless of our actions. So, for example, I don't have to go around saying sexist things to women in order to benefit from the privilege of being a man. If, say I work at a hardware store, and the young woman works at the hardware store, the customers are likely to assume that I know what I'm talking about when I answer their question, whereas a young woman might have to prove the assumption that she wouldn't know as much as I would in that position. And in the past, that would have meant she wouldn't have gotten the job to begin with. And so, and I don't have to go around saying sexist things to benefit from the privileges of my sex and gender. And so these are positional. You don't have to, a rich person doesn't have to go around saying nasty things about poor people in order to have the advantages that come from being rich. They have them whether they're saying classist things or not. Now, these advantages and disadvantages are conditional. The context can determine whether a factor is an advantage or disadvantage. So this means that the things we think of advantages or disadvantages are not always in every possible context an advantage or a disadvantage. Meaning, let's say, for example, if you come from a wealthy family, you're going to have lots of advantages from the day you're born, from even before that, from the prenatal care your mother got to the present. But, there's going to be situations like when you apply for financial aid, where it's the person who came from a low income background that is, in that context, in that one instance, it's going to be an advantage to come from a low income family. And so, or, being white American, can have a lot of advantages, especially in the United States. But, let's say you go to a third world country, you visit a third world country, and you take a wrong turn and end up in a wrong part of town, you're not going to feel like it's an advantage. You're going to feel like a sore thumb sticking out. In which case you can become an easier target than someone that could just fit in and pass as a local. And so they're not 100% always an advantage, 100% of the time always a disadvantage. They can be conditional. Let's talk about some of these terms: prejudice and bias, discrimination, racist and racism. Prejudice and bias. These are some definitions I came up with. They're not necessarily the best definition in the world. It's just they help me talk about this. I do use prejudice and bias interchangeably. One definition that I came up with is a negative feeling, opinion, or attitude toward a certain category, including but not limited to people. And we all have prejudice, we all have bias, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing. you know, you may have a bias against strawberry ice cream over chocolate ice cream. You know, it's we all have them. It's common to have prejudice and bias. But yeah, you know, we do try to not apply them to people, even though to some degree people can't help it if I don't know, in certain, you know, the less exposure people have to something. Discrimination, and usually an action, although it could also be an inaction toward a category of people. And so, yeah, you know, generally we try not to discriminate, but again, it's not necessarily always a bad thing either. Let's say, you know, we discriminate with regard to at what age people can get a driver's license. Or at what age people can consume alcohol, or I guess in the case of Wisconsin, at what age they can buy alcohol. And so yeah, it's yeah, discriminating toward people, although again, it's not always necessarily a bad thing. Race, we talked about this at the beginning of the semester, where race is a social construct, but yet that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a very real effect in people's lives historically and in the present. And then we get to being racist and racism. With regard to those two, these are very essential to this class. In fact, you cannot get 100% on your final essay for this class if you cannot explain the difference between racist and racism. And so I'm going to talk about that right now. So racist is discrimination based on race. Racism is systemic. One definition here is an institutionalized system with disproportionate unjust outcomes for a particular race. For some students, it's helpful to think of it as institutionalized racism or systemic racism. Racism has to do with power. So, you know, discriminating based on race, how do I put this? Like anyone can say something racist, but that is not the same as racism. Racism has to do with power dynamics, with which is the dominant group, which group is going to get the benefit of the doubt by the police, by the judge, by society. It's embedded in the law. You know, I've talked in this class about different examples of laws that have disproportionate, unjust outcomes for very specific groups. And many times, even when the law doesn't explicitly state a specific group that it's targeting. You know, remember the Executive Order 9066 that led to the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans never even mentioned Japanese or Japanese Americans. But yet, the way it was enforced very clearly specifically targeted them. This gets embedded into the economy. You know, who gets paid more? Who gets paid, you know, who do we just assume it's okay to pay them less based on who they are? It gets normalized in culture. They can be associated with status. You know, are different racial groups thought of in regard to different status, kind of similar in an unofficial way, similar to the caste system that we learned about in Spanish America during colonial times. You know, do people think of one group as better than other groups? And then, of course, this is also embedded in politics. So racism, again, is about power. It's embedded in society. It's institutionalized. It's systemic. And someone saying something racist to someone else does not equal racism. Yeah, you know, kind of like similar to those examples I made before where you know, someone doesn't have to be classist or say classist things in order to benefit from being part of a wealthy class, being upper class and so forth. Let me know if any of this is confusing, or there's something that doesn't quite make sense, so I can try to help clarify. Next, I introduce you to this concept of structure compared or versus agency. Structure versus agency. Structure is about systemic pressures. Systemic pressures could be things like the law. You know, the law encourages you to do certain things or penalizes you for doing certain things. And then there's agency, about individual actions. And so there are structures that can work in your favor or against you. Let's say, for example, that you live in a rural area, and if you want to go to elementary school, the closest elementary school is 10 miles away or 20 miles away. That makes it harder for that person living 20 miles away from an elementary school to be able to regularly attend elementary school than someone who lives, you know, within a few blocks of the elementary school. Now, in both cases, people have agency. You can have someone who lives across the street from a school and not go. And on the other hand, you have those stories of people, you know, grandparents 80 years ago, how they used to walk, you know, 10 miles over the hill across the train tracks and through the river to get to their elementary school. But then again, they also had a lower graduation and school attendance rate. So there were the people who used their agency to overcome those structures that worked against them. But that doesn't mean that they weren't in a position where it was harder, and therefore less people were able to use their agency to overcome those structures. So the structures can work with you or against you. It's not always 100%. You know, we don't all live at the same distance from a school. But the way we try to equalize things for everyone is if you live further than X number of miles away from the closest school, then the school board will pay for buses to pick up students to get them to school. And then that way, you know, whether you're a poor person or a wealthy person in a rural area, you know, whether you can afford a vehicle or not, they're trying to equalize things so that everyone can attend school and can overcome some of those structural, it's an acknowledgement of the structural disadvantage that comes to people in different situations. Let's see, I found a couple comics here that connect to this. If you live in a developed country, you come from high socioeconomic status, you feel like, things are easy, why can't you do it? But if you have things working against you, sort of the amount of agency you put into it is not only more, but yeah, I mean, at the very least, in simple terms, it is simply you need greater agency to overcome that. And even if an individual overcomes it, it doesn't mean that it didn't make it harder for a whole segment of society to try to overcome that. Cultural capital. This is useful knowledge that is not taught in school to everyone. An example of cultural capital would be has to do with the reason why we now recognize first generation college students as a group of students that can use greater assistance. Because if your parents went to college, then there's a higher chance that those parents knew what it took to help prepare their children to also be able to go to college. If your parents did not go to college, then you don't have that resource at home that helps prepare you since the 9th grade or even earlier, set you up to be able to go to college, for example. Other examples of cultural capital might be, I'm thinking like the predominance of sports among men, where whether it's the fact that a lot of business decisions get made, say, in golf courses, or whether sports can be kind of a common language and unifying factor for men to network when they're traveling. Like, for men, it's very easy to say you're traveling to New York City, you have a layover in Chicago, and when while you're in Chicago airport, you go to a restaurant or sports bar, you watch sports, and it's very easy to connect with other men and network with them over the sports that you're watching, because you have that cultural capital, that informal knowledge that helps you network and helps you can be beneficial in the business world. Microaggressions. Microaggressions are minor dismissals and insults encountered daily that take a toll. Examples of this could be these expressions like, well, I don't see you as black, or no, but where are you really from? And it's these statements can come across as very minor, yet if you encounter them on a regular basis, I think of it as kind of like getting pinched in the same spot every day, where like, someone pinching you once is not a big deal. But then if people keep pinching you in that same spot on a regular basis, it becomes sensitive and sore. And then there's going to be a time when someone pinches it, does that little pinch, and the person appears to have an oversized reaction to such a small pinch, but it's because your pinch is the 100th time this year that they've gotten that pinch in that same spot. And so they end up having a reaction that seems not commensurate to the statement said or to the pinch. But again, it's because they get this all the time. I would get, the know where you really from. People ask me, so where are you from? From Los Angeles. And I can just tell they're not happy with that answer, because they want to know, what they want to know is where outside of the US are my ancestors from? And how do I put this? A problem with this is the assumption, it's kind of the practice of identifying people as other, and B, it's making people feel like they don't belong or fit in. And again, in some of these cases, it's people that have been in the part of the United States, citizens of the United States for many generations, and they just can't shake it off. Meaning they just keep having these experiences generation after generation. They're still happening to their descendants. Dog whistles, code words. This is when politicians, ever since the civil rights movement, politicians have turned to dog whistles or code words to signify, they can no longer, people can no longer use the N-word, or people can no longer be explicitly racist. And so then now people will use dog whistles or code words so that their audience that they want to communicate with will know what they're talking about. And so, yeah, politicians definitely still use these. Some kind of longtime examples of this kind of thing, inner city crime versus the heartland, or illegal aliens for Latinos, as opposed to the silent majority. And so, yeah, they're just examples of dog whistles. Now, how do we determine justice and or fairness in our society? How do we know if our society is just or fair? Whoops. All right, so how do we determine justice and or fairness in our society? We look at things like statistics, representation in important categories like education, income, the justice system, politics, healthcare, etc. Now, are we ready for a colorblind society? Should a colorblind society even be our goal? Can you think of a better goal? Well, there we go. All right, so I'm going to show you this short video called Racism is Real. And these are some of the things that are pointed out in that video. And I guess I could show you these again after I play it. So. Yeah, so in that one, they sent in, there was a study done where they sent in identical resumes. The only difference in the resumes was the name, and Black sounding names were 50% less likely to get a call back. Yeah, when it comes to finances, you would think, credit score is a credit score. How can there be bias and discrimination be part of that? But there's a lot of studies that have repeatedly shown that who you are plays a role in what kind of loan you get and the interest rates and so forth. I will leave this up so that you can see kind of the summary of some of the things brought up in that video.